In this video, I'm going to show you how to replace the rear caliper on this Chevy Silverado 2500. Let's install this brand new TRQ caliper. Let's remove the wheel. First, if your truck has these, remove your center caps with a 22mm socket. These are just plastic mounting nuts, so be careful with them. You don't want to break them. Take this off and set it aside. Now remove all 8 of your 22mm lug nuts. If your wheel is stuck like this one, put one lug nut back on for safety, and then take a rubber mallet and tap it with that rubber mallet on the tire, not on the rim, from the backside. There we go. The lug nut held that wheel on so it doesn't fall off. Now take it off and remove the wheel. Now let's remove the caliper. As an assembly, the whole thing, it will be difficult to get up to the top slider pin bolt like this because of the leaf spring. So I'm going to take a 21mm socket, remove this bolt down here that holds the bracket onto the rear axle, and then I'll do the same on the top, except on the top I'll have to do it by hand because I cannot fit a power tool up there. Once again, 21mm socket, remove this bolt. Okay, that's out. I will, however, leave it in a few threads to hold the caliper while I loosen up the top one. On the top, I'm just going to use a long ratchet. Get some leverage. If you have a breaker bar that'll fit in here, that would be ideal. There we go. Take this bolt out completely. To make removing this caliper a little bit easier, I'm going to take a long screwdriver, stick it right in between the rotor and the caliper here, and pry inward a little bit. This is going to squeeze those pistons in and allow us to remove the caliper a little bit easier off the rotor like this. It basically releases the force of the pads. As you can see, this is already coming off. Let's remove this lower bolt that I left in for safety. And I'm going to take this off, put it right on the leaf spring. Don't let the caliper hang on the brake hose. It will stretch it and damage it internally, so make sure it has no pressure on it. Now let's remove the pads off of this old caliper. I'm just going to use a little pry bar to pry them out. You can tap them with a hammer if they're really stuck. All right, so that pad is out. However, it did break. I do have new pads, so for this video I will be using new pads, but I'm going to continue showing you how to remove these just for the purposes of this instructional video. But if obviously your pads are damaged, do not reuse them. You can stick a pry bar through this slot right here and use a hammer on the back of the pry bar. All right, there's the inner pad. Now let's remove these boots with a pocket screwdriver. And these are what cover the heads of your slider pins where you could stick a socket and remove them. Take both of these off. Make sure you don't damage these boots, otherwise water will get in here and rust everything out. Now take a 10mm Allen socket and remove the slider pin bolts. Make sure that you keep them separate because as you can see, this one has a rubber bushing on it, whereas this one does not. So now the caliper separates. I can push this up. As you can see, this is just a solid piece, so I'm going to put the caliper down like this and I will leave these slider pins on their corresponding side. Now take your slider pin, and I like to re-lubricate this using silicone paste. You can use brake grease if that's what you have. The silicone paste is rated for brakes, which means it withstands higher temperatures. You want to make sure that whatever you're using does withstand higher temperatures so that it doesn't melt and run out as the brakes heat up. I put a thin layer on this pin, and I'm going to put a thin layer inside here. You don't have to put a lot. If you do, it's actually just going to get squeezed out as you slide this pin in. You want to make sure it slides nice and smooth and gets down into the boot part here. Speaking of the boot, if you want to, you can pop this off, just like that, and add a little bit of silicone paste in here. This will act as a reserve of grease for the slider pin. Don't put too much. Once again, if you put too much, it'll squeeze out, and that's not what you want. You don't want this to get all over your brakes. Make sure that's seated nicely. And now we'll do the same exact thing to this one over here. Now on each corner of the caliper bracket, you'll see these machined areas. This is where your anti-rattle clips go. And you want to put a thin layer of grease, brake grease, silicone paste, whatever you're using for your brakes on here. This will prevent corrosion from building up. Don't put too much, because if you do, as soon as you put the anti-rattle clips on, it'll actually squeeze out. And this is where your rotor rides. It'll get on the rotor, and that's what you're trying to avoid. You do not want grease on your rotor. So a thin layer will do the job here, just enough to prevent corrosion. When you put these on, you want to make sure this hook goes towards the outside of the caliper. In here, there can't be anything because, well, it'll come in contact with the rotor. Squeeze these on. Make sure they're fully seated down. If they're not, the pad will not have any space to get in there. So you want to put both of them on this side. They're all the same, all four of them. You just have to make sure you grab the right one. And we'll flip the caliper bracket over. Put this one on. And last one, just like so. And because we cannot assemble the caliper while it's on the truck, we have to assemble it here and then put it on as an assembly. Having said that, it is time to put this together, and then we'll slide the pads in. So let's reinstall the bracket onto the caliper. I'm going to thread in my bracket slider pins here. Okay. I had my air impact on the lowest setting, so at this point they're bottomed out and snugged. I am going to try to torque them now, but obviously the caliper is free floating here, so I will just do my best to make them as tight as I can. 77 foot-pounds is the torque for both of these slider pins. I'm going to stick a pry bar right through here so I can have some leverage and hold this as I torque these down. All right, that's one. Let's torque the other one. All right, that's the second one. It's very important that you put these caps back on. This is what makes this water resistant and makes sure that no debris gets in here. You want to make sure you squeeze all of the air that builds up in here. There we go. So press the caliper into the bracket into the caliper like that. And now let's flip it upright and install our pads. When it comes to installing these pads, one pad will have a wear indicator, the other one will not. And you want the wear indicator on the inboard pad, so where the pistons are, and you want this, if the caliper was mounted on the truck, you want this on the bottom. For me, if I put this up as if it was mounted, it would be right here. So I'm going to take this pad, and with that wear indicator on this side, I'm going to slide it into the anti-rattle clips. They are slightly spring-loaded here, so you will have to push on that spring a little bit and slide them in. That will allow you to seat them properly. You may need a pocket screwdriver or whatever you have to help you pry this as you slide the pad in. Just like that. It should go down nice and smoothly. Now let's do the same to the outer pad. This one does not have a wear indicator. All right, press it up like that. Our pads are installed, and this caliper assembly with the pads is ready to go back on the truck. Now let's get the caliper on the truck, line it up, and put in whatever bolt lines up first, just so you can let go of it. For me, you can see the top, and it's lined up, it's threading on. So at this point, once it's on a few threads, I can safely let go and start in the bottom one. Don't put any grease on these bolts or anti-seize, anything like that. If you're going to put anything, I strongly recommend using thread locker. Let's tighten these up and then torque them. 221 foot-pounds is the torque for these bolts. Now take an 11mm socket and remove the banjo bolt off of your old caliper. Have a collection bucket ready because brake fluid will want to start leaking out. Take that bolt off. Make sure there are no copper washers left on the hose. I know both of mine came off. Remove the banjo bolt from the new caliper. This is also an 11 millimeter in size. What I'm going to do is inspect the hose, make sure it's in good condition. Mine is. I'm going to take one copper washer, slide it over the bolt, put that through the hose, and then on the other side, put another copper washer on, basically sandwich the hose in between the two, and then make sure the hose is going up. Tighten this up, start it by hand, make sure it's starting in nice and smooth. Let's bottom this out before we lose too much brake fluid. Snug it, that should stop the leak. Now let's torque it. 30 foot-pounds is the torque for this. It's important that you crush those copper washers so that they can make a nice tight seal. If it's still leaking after you torque it down, there might be some debris built up in there and you will probably need a new brake hose because this is too rusty. Now I'm going to clean all this off so I can make sure there's no brake fluid leak, but I also need to do a gravity bleed. This caliper is full of air, so fluid needs to fill it up. So let's move up to the bleeder screw. Come up to the bleeder screw, pop this cover off. Sometimes it's a little bit challenging. There we go. Put in a safe spot. It's important that these go back on. Take a 10 millimeter socket, break this free, and now we're going to let gravity pull fluid down into the caliper, fill it up, push all the air out, and you should see a steady trickle of fluid coming out of the bleeder screw when you're done with the gravity bleed. We have a steady trickle of brake fluid, so I can close it up and do my manual brake bleed. Make sure that's nice and snug. Now let's clean off any residue of brake fluid to make sure that you don't confuse it for a potential leak in the future. Use brake parts cleaner, spray this all down. Cap this off. It's important that no debris gets in there and clogs it up. Let's get the wheel on. Put on all 8 of your lug nuts, bottom them out in a cross pattern, and then also in a cross pattern, we're going to torque them to 140 foot-pounds. Once again, 140 foot-pounds in a cross pattern. Put your center cap on if your truck has this, and with the same socket you used for the lug nuts, tighten these up just by hand, make them snug. These are plastic. If you strip them out once, they probably won't hold anymore. So just go in a cross pattern, that way this seats evenly. Tighten these up. They kind of click in place once they're locked in, so that's how you know.
When only the best will do, demand TRQ. The only company that lets you view before you do. TRQ is committed to offering the highest quality aftermarket auto parts that are engineered for peace of mind. Thanks for using and viewing with TRQ.